The train groaned against the steel tracks, a beast of iron and smoke pushing west into the teeth of 1886. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coal dust, unwashed bodies, and the faint, sour tang of fear. Clara Whitmore sat pressed against the window. Though the glass was so clouded with frost and soot, there was nothing to see but a gray, rushing blur. She was alone. In her lap, her hands, raw and chapped, were clenched tight around the thin handle of a worn carpet bag. Tucked inside that satchel, wrapped in her only spare shift, was a letter. It was her only map to a future. The paper was creased and soft from 100 readings, the ink precise. It was signed by a man she had never met, Mr. Thomas Mercer, of Miles City, Montana Territory. Clara was not a woman given to wild gambles. Back in New York, she had been respectable. She had been Mrs. Arthur Whitmore, wife to a kind, if frail, man who ran a small but respected mercantile. They had a quiet life, a life built on routine and the shared understanding that they would, God willing, grow old together. God, it turned out, was not willing. The influenza took Arthur in 3 days, leaving Clara a widow at 28, draped in black silk and stunned by the silence of her own home. The silence did not last. Arthur's family, who had always looked down on her as a woman with no connections, descended. His older brother, Silas, and his wife, Beatrice, arrived with condolences that felt like knives. They spoke of settling Arthur's affairs, which soon became managing the estate, which soon became questioning the accounts. Clara, who had helped Arthur with the ledgers for years, knew the books were sound, but Silas, a man with a damp handshake and eyes that never quite met hers, saw an opportunity. He saw a woman alone, a small inheritance, and a way to absorb his brother's assets into his own failing business. The accusation came on a Tuesday. Beatrice claimed her diamond brooch, a family heirloom, was missing. She suggested Clara, in her grief, might have misplaced it. Then Silas found discrepancies in the household cash box. It was a lie, constructed as neatly as a coffin. They painted her as a thief, a desperate widow pilfering from the family that had so graciously taken her in. They gave her a choice. Delivered by Silas in the cold parlor, the curtains drawn against the sun. She could face the magistrate, public shame, and almost certain prison. They had associates who would swear to her unstable character. Or she could vanish. "A woman in your position, Clara," Silas had said, his voice slick with false pity, "will find the world very cruel, but a prison is crueler. Take what little you have and go. West, perhaps. Start over. We will tell the world you are overcome with grief and have retired to a sanitarium. Exile or prison." She sold her wedding ring and a silver locket from her own mother. It bought her a third-class ticket on the Union Pacific and left her with $11. She had seen the advertisement in a discarded newspaper. Wife wanted. A God-fearing man with established acreage in Montana seeks a respectable woman for matrimony. Must be honest and willing to work. No past required. She wrote to the address given. The reply was brief, businesslike, and confirmed her passage. It was signed Thomas Mercer. Now, Clara clutched the letter and stared at the gray blur of the Wyoming Territory. She was not a wife, not a widow, not even truly Clara Whitmore anymore. She was a fugitive, running on the hope of a stranger's name. The train, which had been slowing for the last hour, finally shuddered to a halt, the shriek of the brakes sounding like a human scream. A blast of frigid air hit the car as the conductor shoved the door open, his mustache white with ice.
"Rawlins! This is Rawlins! Wyoming Territory! End of the line for this train! Storms close the pass!"
Clara's heart seized.
"Rawlins! No, I am bound for Miles City, Montana!"
The conductor, weary and cold, barely looked at her.
"Montana's north, and you ain't getting there from here, ma'am, not till this blizzard breaks, and the spur line is clear. Could be weeks. This is as far as we go."
Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Clara's chest. She gathered her satchel and stepped down onto the platform, into a world of white chaos. The wind ripped the breath from her lungs, driving snow sideways in stinging sheets. The town was little more than a dozen wooden structures huddled against the tracks, looking like they might be scraped off the earth at any moment. She stumbled into the small, overheated station house. It smelled of wet wool and chewing tobacco. A few grizzled men in buffalo coats stared at her. She approached the station master, a haggard man with a green visor. "Sir, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I am looking for a Mr. Thomas Mercer. I was told he was in Miles City, but perhaps the letter was wrong. Does he live near here?" The station master stopped sorting his papers and looked at her over his spectacles. He chewed on his tobacco, then spat a brown stream into a spittoon. "Mercer," he grunted. "Don't know no Thomas Mercer. Do you, Hank?" One of the men by the stove shook his head. "Nope, no Thomas round here." Clara's knees felt weak. $11. The wrong town. A blizzard. "He must be here. He has a ranch. He wrote to me." The station master frowned, thinking, "Wait, now. There is a Mercer, but it ain't Thomas. It's Eli. Eli Mercer." Hope flared, painful and bright. "Yes, that must be it. Eli Mercer. Where can I find him? Is his ranch nearby?" The men looked at each other. The one called Hank let out a low whistle. "Ma'am," the station master said, his voice softer now. "You don't want to be looking for Eli Mercer. His place ain't nearby. It's way up in the Wind River foothills, a good 20 miles north, and half of that is straight up a goat trail." "And Eli," Hank added, standing up and brushing snow from his coat. "He don't take visitors. Not for 15 years. He is a recluse, ma'am," the station master said. "A hard man. Lost his whole family in a fire. They say his wife, his child, and his brother, too, come to think of it, burned up." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. His brother? Aye, that was his name. Thomas. Thomas Mercer died in that fire with the rest of them. 15 years ago. The letter in her bag suddenly felt like a stone. The advertisement. The brief, unsigned reply. It was a mistake. A horrible, cruel mistake. A ghost had summoned her. She must have swayed, because the station master gripped her elbow. "Ma'am, you look peaky. You best get a room at the hotel. This storm's a bad one." Clara pulled away gently. A hotel room would cost $1, maybe $2. Her money would be gone in a week, and she would be stranded, a pauper, with Silas's lies hanging over her. Prison, she thought, would have been faster. "No," she said, her voice thin but hard. I must still go. This man, Eli Mercer, he is the only one I know. He is family to the man who wrote. He might help me." "Help you?" Hank scoffed. "Eli Mercer wouldn't throw water on you if you was a fire. He's mean, ma'am, broken." "I have no other choice," she whispered. She spent 4 of her precious dollars paying a mail carrier, a wiry man named Jed, to take her as far as his wagon would go. Jed argued the whole way, telling her it was suicide, that the snow was already drifting, that Eli Mercer was more bear than man. "He lives up there with ghosts, ma'am." Jed shouted over the howl of the wind as the wagon bucked and slid on the barely visible track. "He don't want the living." "Just take me as far as you can," Clara shouted back, her face numb beneath her thin wool shawl. He dropped her, true to his word, where the trail turned from a wagon path into a narrow track winding up the mountain. The snow was already past her ankles. The wagon disappeared back into the white curtain, leaving her in a silence so profound it felt like pressure against her ears. There was only the trail, marked by the dark trunks of lodgepole pines, and the unrelenting white. She walked. The next hours were a blur of misery. The elevation stole her breath. Her city boots, never meant for this, were soaked through in minutes, her feet turning into blocks of painful ice. The wind clawed at her, seeming to find every gap in her clothing. Her satchel, holding everything she owned, felt like it was filled with rocks. She fell. She got up. She fell again. She told herself that Silas Whitmore would not win. She told herself that a jail cell in New York was colder than this mountain. She lied to herself, and she kept walking. She did not know how long it had been. The gray light of the afternoon was already fading into a bruised purple when she finally cleared her eyes. And there it was, a cabin, low and dark, hunkered down in a clearing, looking like it had grown from the frozen earth. A barn, listing slightly to one side, stood nearby. A thin tendril of wood smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of life. She stumbled across the clearing, her legs failing. She was sick now, a deep cough rattling in her chest. She reached the door, rough-hewn planks, dark with age, and pounded on it with a numb fist. She heard nothing. She pounded again, harder, using the last of her strength. A sound from within, a heavy boot scraping the floor, the metallic snick of a rifle bolt being drawn. The door scraped open 6 inches. Clara found herself staring into the darkest, coldest eyes she had ever seen. They were the color of a winter sky, set deep in a face that was all angles and shadow, obscured by a thick, untamed beard streaked with gray. He was a big man, filling the doorway, and in his hands he held a Winchester rifle, its barrel pointed at the floor, but ready. He said nothing. He just stared, his expression unreadable. Shocked. He was looking at her as if she were an apparition, something impossible. Clara leaned against the doorframe. The world was tilting. She tried to speak, to explain. The name. She had to say the name. "Mr. Mercer?" she gasped. I am here for Thomas." She saw his eyes narrow, a flicker of some terrible, old pain crossing his face. Then the last of her strength gave out. The cold, the hunger, and the terror finally claimed her. The ground rushed up, and Clara Whitmore fainted at his feet, collapsing like a pile of wet rags onto the snowy threshold. Eli Mercer stood frozen for a full 10 seconds. A woman, here, at his door, in a blizzard. The biting wind rushing into his cabin finally broke the spell. He let out a curse, low and rough from disuse, and looked up at the sky, as if blaming God himself for this intrusion. He leaned the rifle against the wall, bent down, and with a grunt, scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling storm. He did not put her in his own bed. He carried her past the main hearth, through the curtained doorway into the small, freezing spare room. It was his brother's room. It had not been slept in for 15 years. He laid her on the cot, her wet, frozen clothes smelling of the city and the storm. For a moment, he was paralyzed. He did not touch people. He had not willingly touched another human being since the fire. But the woman was shivering, a violent, rattling tremor that shook the small bed. Her lips were blue. He worked with a grim, mechanical roughness. He pulled off her frozen boots, her soaked coat and shawl. He left her in her damp traveling dress, knowing it was not enough. But it was all he could stand. He piled the bed with every quilt and dried buffalo hide he had, burying her under their weight. He stoked the fire in the main room until it roared, then shoveled hot coals into the small, rusty stove in the spare room. He worked the bellows until the iron began to snap and ping with heat. He went to his pantry and cut several strips of dried venison, adding a hard biscuit from his own stores. He filled a tin cup with water from the melted snow bucket. He placed them on the rickety bedside table. Then he left, pulling the curtain shut. Clara woke slowly, drawn up from a deep, black well. Her first sensation was warmth, a heavy, scratchy warmth that pressed down on her from all sides. Her second was the smell of wood smoke and the faint, savory scent of cured meat. She opened her eyes. She was in a small room, the walls made of chinked logs. The only light came from the orange glow of a small pot-bellied stove in the corner, which radiated a fierce, dry heat. She was in a bed, under a mountain of rough quilts. On the table beside her sat a tray, dried meat, a biscuit, and a cup of water. She sat up too quickly. The room spun. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She was still in her dress, though it was drier now. He was in the doorway. Clara stifled a scream. He just stood there. The man from the door, silent as the snow. He held a steaming mug in his hand. "You fainted," he said. His voice was like gravel rolling downhill, rough and low. Yes, I apologize, Mr. Mercer," she said, her throat dry. "I am Clara Whitmore." He did not move. He did not introduce himself. He just watched her. "I am so sorry to intrude," she said, forcing the words out. "I was looking for Mr. Thomas Mercer. The station master said Thomas was gone." Eli's face, already hard, seemed to turn to granite. "He is been gone 15 years. I see. I am so very sorry. There has been a terrible mistake." Clara pushed the heavy quilts back. The floor was ice cold beneath her stockinged feet. "I must leave. I never meant to trouble you." She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. "Where you going?" he asked. It was not a question of concern. It was a flat statement of fact. "Back to the town. I will find passage." He walked past her. She flinched as his shadow crossed the bed and looked out the room's single, small window, which was caked over with frost and snow. "No, you won't," he said. "Trails closed. Passes blocked. Nothing is moving on this mountain till the storm breaks. And it's just gotten started." Clara sank back onto the cot. Trapped. She was trapped on a mountain with a wild man who looked at her with dead eyes, in a cabin owned by a ghost. "I cannot stay here," she whispered, tears of frustration and terror welling. "You ain't leaving." He turned and pushed the tin mug he was holding onto the bedside table, sloshing hot liquid onto the wood. It was coffee, black and bitter. "Eat. You're sick." He left the room, leaving the curtain that served as a door wide open. Night fell. It did not fall gently. It descended like an axe, plunging the world into a deep, howling blackness. The wind battered the small cabin, shrieking through the pines, rattling the door in its frame. It sounded like a living thing trying to get in. Clara ate the meat, which was tough and salty, and drank the water. She huddled in the bed, in the small room that felt like a cell within a prison. In the main room, she could hear him. He was not sleeping. He was pacing. She heard the heavy, relentless tread of his boots on the floorboards, back and forth, from the hearth to the door, from the door to the hearth, a caged animal, restless and worn. Clara pulled the rough quilts up to her chin, her body aching and her heart pounding. She was alone. He was alone. And the two of them were locked on top of the world by the snow, with only the ghosts and the wind for company. The snow did not stop. For 3 days, it fell, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, choking torrent that buried the world. The mountains disappeared. The trees became white pillars. The world shrank until it was only the cabin, the nearby barn, and the howling, white void that surrounded them. Clara's sickness bloomed in the small, warm room, then broke. The fever left her weak and trembling, but alive. On the 4th day, the snow lessened to a steady, grim fall, and she emerged from her room, her legs unsteady. Eli was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on an oiled rag. He did not look up when she emerged, but his hands, which had been moving with methodical grace, went still for a second. I am better, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice thin. "Thank you for the shelter." He grunted, his eyes fixed on a trigger mechanism. The silence of the cabin was as heavy as the snow on the roof. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the relentless pacing of the man. He had not stopped. Every night, she heard him, walking, walking, walking. Clara knew she could not be idle. She was a guest, but she was also a burden. She began, slowly, to move about the cabin. It was a man's space, functional, and layered with the dust of years of neglect. She found a broom and swept the floor, her movements quiet, careful not to disturb him. She washed the tin plates from their silent meals and stacked them. He said nothing. He just watched. She would be at the hearth, adding a log to the fire, and she would feel his eyes on her from the table. She would be trying to wash her shift in a bucket of snowmelt, and she would see his reflection in the frosted window, standing in the barn doorway, a dark statue. He watched her like a man watches a wild, unpredictable animal he has found in one of his traps. On the 5th day, she found the chickens. Behind a snowdrift, tucked against the leeward side of the barn, was a small, half-buried coop. She heard the faint, desperate clucking. She waded through the snow, which came up to her waist, and dug open the small door. Inside, half a dozen thin, ragged birds huddled for warmth, their water frozen, their feed scattered. She cleared the ice from their water tin, found a sack of cracked corn in the barn, and threw it to them. They fell upon it, a flurry of desperate feathers. As she turned to leave, Eli was standing 10 feet away, a snow-covered shovel in his hand. He had been digging a path. He looked at the chickens, then at her. His gaze was flat, but there was something else beneath it. Surprise. "They was my wife's," he said. The words were so sudden, so unexpected, she almost stumbled. It was the first time he had offered a single piece of his life. They are good hens," Clara said lamely. He nodded once, curtly, then turned and went back to his shoveling, the rhythm of it harsh and angry. Scrape, heave, throw. Scrape, heave, throw. She took over the care of the hens. It gave her a reason to be outside, to breathe air that was not thick with wood smoke and silence. It was a small, living thing to care for. In the cabin, she grew bolder in her cleaning. She was mending one of his torn shirts, a task she took from a pile in the corner, when she saw the frame. It was on the high mantel, tucked behind a rusty lantern, and it was face down. Her fingers itched to see it, but she respected his privacy. It was not her place. Days later, while she was sweeping the ash from the hearth, her broom nudged the mantel leg. The frame teetered and fell onto the stone, the glass cracking. "Oh," she whispered, dropping the broom. Eli, who was by the door pulling on his boots, flinched as if shot. He turned, his face dark. "I am so sorry," Clara said, her hands shaking as she knelt to pick it up. It fell. I will fix the glass, if I can." She turned it over in her hands. It was a tintype, dim and formal. A woman, young, with dark hair parted in the center and a shy, sweet smile. She was holding a baby, a bundle of white linen, its face a pale, sleeping moon. Beside the frame was another, smaller tintype she had not seen. A young man, clean-shaven, who looked so much like Eli it startled her. But his eyes were different. They were soft, open, and smiling. Clara looked from the smiling man in the picture to the bearded, cold-eyed man by the door. Eli's face was ashen. He looked at the photographs in her hand as if she were holding 2 hot coals. "Put it down," he said, his voice a low growl. "She was beautiful," Clara whispered, unable to help herself. "And the baby." "Put it down." She gently placed the frames back on the mantel, this time turning them to face the room. He said nothing more. He yanked open the door and plunged into the snow, slamming it behind him so hard the new crack in the glass spiderwebbed. That night, he did not pace. He sat at the table, staring into the fire, drinking from a stone jug. Clara stayed in her room, the curtain drawn, listening to the silence, which was somehow more terrible than the pacing. The storm broke, but the cold held. The snow was piled in drifts 10 feet high, locking them in. The work of survival became all there was. Eli spent his days clearing paths, hunting, and chopping wood, his axe strokes echoing across the white valley. One afternoon, Clara saw him on the barn roof. The wind had ripped a section of shingles away, leaving a gaping hole. He was up there, in the biting wind, trying to nail down new slats of pine, his heavy gloves making the work clumsy. He was slipping on the icy shingles. She pulled on the spare pair of oversized boots he kept by the door, wrapped her shawl tight, and went out. The cold seizes her. She climbed the ladder, her skirts whipping around her legs. He heard the scrape of her boots and looked down, his face a mask of anger.
"Get down!"
He shouted over the wind.
"You'll be blown off!"
"You will drop the hammer," she shouted back, clinging to the top rung. "Or your nails. Let me hand them to you." He stared at her for a long moment, the wind tearing at his beard. He looked like a god of winter, furious and wild, but he was also just a man, losing his grip on a frozen hammer. He gave a sharp nod. For 2 hours, they worked. It was a brutal ballet. He would set a slat, and she would be ready. A nail held out, her mittens clumsy. He would take it, his own glove brushing hers. Hammer, hammer, hammer. The sound was flat in the dense, cold air. She would hand him another. Hammer, hammer, hammer. Her hands were numb, aching past the point of pain. She fumbled a nail, dropping it. It slid down the icy roof and vanished into the drift below. "I am sorry," she cried. He grunted, pulling off his own glove to reach into his pouch. His bare hand was red and raw. As he pulled the nail free, his fingers brushed the back of her mittened hand. It was nothing, a flicker of contact, but it felt like a static shock. Clara pulled her hand back. Eli froze, his bare fingers curled in the air. Neither of them looked at the other. He turned, set the nail, and drove it home in 3 perfect, violent strokes. "Go inside," he said, his back to her. "You're freezing." "We are not finished. Go inside." She climbed down, her body shaking so hard she almost missed the last rung. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The silence was still there, but it was thinner, tense. They ate their dinner of rabbit stew. He had taught her how to snare them, and Clara watched him. He seemed agitated, his jaw tight. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The wind moaned outside. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice quiet. He looked up, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "That letter," she said, her heart hammering. "The one that brought me here. I must know who wrote it. It was signed Thomas Mercer, but the station master said he said he died 15 years ago." Eli put his spoon down. He stared at her, and for the first time, his cold eyes showed a flicker of raw, genuine confusion. "What letter?" "The advertisement," she said. She rose, went to her room, and retrieved the folded, worn paper from her satchel. She brought it back and laid it on the table between them. He did not touch it. He read the words, his lips moving almost imperceptibles. "Wife wanted, Montana acreage, respectable woman." "And this," she said, placing the brief reply next to it. It just said to come. It was not signed with a name, only T. Mercer at the bottom of the advertisement. Eli looked from the papers to her face. A terrible, dawning comprehension moved across his features. He looked, for a second, like a man who had seen a ghost. "Thomas," he whispered. He reached out a calloused finger and touched his brother's name. "He wrote this." "But how? He is gone." "He wrote it before," Eli said, his voice hollow. "A long time ago, the winter before the fire. He was lonely. He wanted a wife. He was the hopeful one. Eli leaned back, his big hands gripping the edge of the table. He must have sent it to a newspaper back east, paid for it to run, and then— His voice trailed off. And then the fire. Clara finished for him, her stomach clenching. He never got a reply, Eli said, his gaze distant, lost in the past. Or maybe he did, and they burned. I don't know. I never knew he'd done this. After, I found his things, his papers. I burned most of them. But maybe this letter came after. Maybe it got put in a box. I don't know. Clara's mind reeled. But the reply. I wrote to the address on the ad. Someone replied to me, this past autumn. Eli shook his head, looking at the papers. No, that's just the advertisement. See? T. Mercer, Miles City. You wrote, but you never got a reply. You just came. Clara looked at the letter she had carried for 1,000 miles. He was right. It was not a reply. It was the original advertisement she had cut from the paper, and a brief note from the newspaper office confirming the ad had been placed by a T. Mercer. She had mistaken it for a summons. She had come west on the ghost of a 15-year-old hope. Oh, dear God, she whispered, sinking onto the bench. I came here for no one. For a mistake. My brother, Eli said, his voice cracking. The sound was like ice breaking. He died. They all died. 15 years ago, in the spring. Clara looked at him, her own predicament forgotten. His face was gray, his eyes fixed on the fire, but seeing something else entirely. The snow was melting, he said, his voice barely a rasp. Just like this, I was in town, arguing with a supplier about feed prices. A stupid fight, just stupid. He stopped. He swallowed, his throat working. A storm came up, a late one. Wind. It took me 2 days to get back up the mountain. I should have been one. He clenched his fists on the table. I could smell the smoke from 5 miles away. Clara held her breath. It was the stovepipe, he whispered. In the main room. It was old. I'd meant to fix it. I told Sarah, my wife, I told her I'd fix it before I left. But I was in a hurry, angry about the feed. He closed his eyes. When I got here, the cabin was gone. Just gone. A pile of black timbers. The barn was burning. The wind it had spread. He was not looking at her. He was looking through her, into the inferno. I found Thomas first, by the door. He'd gotten out, but he'd gone back in. For them. His voice broke. He put a hand over his mouth, his broad shoulders shaking. Sarah, he choked out. And Lily, my girl, she was only 2. Clara felt tears freezing on her own cheeks. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. This was a grief too vast to be touched by words. I built this cabin, he said, gesturing at the walls around them. I built it on the same spot. I used the new wood. I thought I could, I don't know, but I buried them. All 3 of them. Up on the ridge. Thomas, Sarah, Lily. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw. So you see, ma'am, there is no Thomas Mercer. There is no one here, just me, and I am the man who let them burn. He stood so abruptly his bench crashed to the floor. He grabbed his coat, tore the door open, and walked out into the freezing night. Clara sat, stunned, the cabin feeling colder than it ever had. She understood now. The pacing, the silence, the watching. He was a man living in his own grave, tending the ghosts. She waited. An hour passed. The fire burned low. The wind picked up again, and with it came a new sound, the sharp, stinging tick-tick-tick of freezing rain against the windows. She could not leave him out there. Not in this, not after that. She pulled on her own coat and boots and went out. The night was black and glittering with ice. The wind cut her to the bone. Mr. Mercer, she called. Eli. No answer, only the wind and the ice. She found him by the woodpile. He had thrown off his coat, which lay in a frozen heap on the snow. He was standing in just his long-sleeved shirt and trousers, his head thrown back, his arms wide, letting the freezing rain sheet over him. He was courting pneumonia. He was punishing himself. "Eli!" she screamed, running to him, slipping on the ice. He did not look at her. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of agony. "Get inside," she begged, grabbing his arm. It was rigid, the muscle hard as frozen wood. "You will die."
Let me,
he rasped, his teeth chattering.
It's cold. It's not hot.
She understood. He was trying to burn the fire out of his memory with ice.
No,
she said, her voice fierce. She ran back to the cabin, grabbed the heaviest woolen blanket from his own bed, and ran back out. He was still standing there, a statue of ice and guilt. She threw the blanket around his shoulders, her small frame straining as she pulled the heavy, wet wool tight around his chest. She had to press her body against his to do it. She felt the violent, racking shivers that shook his entire frame. "Please," she whispered, her face against his icy shirt. "Please come inside. For them, they would not want this." That broke him. A sound tore from his chest, a deep, animal groan. He slumped, his head falling forward. She guided him, half dragging, half carrying his dead weight, back to the cabin. She got him inside, slammed the door, and pushed him onto the bench by the fire. He was shivering so hard his teeth sounded like they might break. "Your shirt," she said, her voice urgent. "It's frozen. You must take it off." He was unresponsive, staring at the floor. She did it herself. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the buttons. She could not undo them. In a moment of desperation, she grabbed her mending scissors and cut the threads, ripping the shirt open. She pulled the frozen fabric off his shoulders, and she gasped. In the flickering light of the fire, his back was a landscape of ruin. Thick, ropey scars, white and puckered, covered his shoulders and ran down his left side. He had not just been late. He had been in it. He had tried to get to them. He had gone into the fire, just as his brother had. He had lied. He had not just let them burn. He had tried to save them and failed. He sat, his magnificent, ruined back to her, his head in his hands, shaking. Clara stood there, the wet blanket pooled at his feet. Her heart ached with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. This man, this hard, cold man, was the most broken thing she had ever seen. She did not think, she acted. She stepped behind him. His whole body went rigid. He expected a blow. He expected judgment. Slowly, she raised her hand. Her fingers trembled. She laid her palm flat against the scarred landscape of his back. He flinched, a violent full-body spasm, and a sharp intake of breath hissed through his teeth, but he did not pull away. She left her hand there, letting her own warmth press against the cold skin and the raised, dead tissue of the burns. She felt the tremors beneath her palm. She leaned in, the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and the ice storm filling her nose. She pressed her lips, soft and warm, to the ruined peak of his shoulder. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of peace, an absolution. "You are not the fire," she whispered. She held it for a beat, two, then stepped back. She picked up the dry blanket from his bed and wrapped it firmly around him. She stoked the fire until it roared, adding log after log. Then she went to her room, pulled the curtain, and left him alone with the flames. Eli sat there until dawn. He did not move. He just watched the fire, the wool blanket clutched in his fists. When the first gray light touched the window, he stood up. He was stiff, his body aching, but the shivering had stopped. The fever he was chasing had not caught him. He looked at the curtain to her room. He heard her soft, even breathing. He turned to the table. The two papers were still there. Thomas's old dream and the list of shipping agents. He picked up the advertisement. the one that had brought this strange, quiet, brave woman to his door. He looked at his brother's name. He walked to the hearth and dropped the paper into the flames. He watched it curl, brown, and turn to white ash. He was burning the mistake. He was burning the ghost. He turned and looked at her curtain again. The trail would be passable in a few days. The snow had stopped. He went to the corner, pulled on his boots, and picked up his axe. He had wood to chop. He did not ask her to leave. The burning of the letter was a turning point. He had not asked her to leave, and she had not offered. The high mountain pass to Rawlins, though no longer in the grip of the blizzard, was still a treacherous thing. A river of mud and melting snowdrifts as tall as a house. They were, for now, still prisoners of the spring thaw. So they worked. A new rhythm settled over the ranch. No longer the tense, watchful waiting of two strangers, but the quiet, shared labor of two people with a single purpose, survival. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a hollow, aching void. It was a shared space, full of understanding. It was the silence of Eli sharpening his axe, the steady shing 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 of the stone. It was the silence of Clara, her head bent, mending the torn canvas of his heavy coat, the small, quick snick of her needle pulling thread. He taught her things. He showed her how to reset the traps, his big scarred hands moving with a precise economy, showing her how to find the trigger, how to bait it with a bit of dried apple. He taught her how to walk on the snowshoes, a task that looked simple and felt impossible. Walk wide, he'd grunted, his voice impersonal as he adjusted the leather bindings on her boots. Don't step on your own feet, and don't look down. She fell, often, the first few times. He just stood there, waiting, his face impassive. The fifth time she went down, tangling her feet and vanishing to her waist in a soft drift. A small sound escaped him. It was a puff of air, almost a laugh, but it died before it was born. He reached down and offered her the end of his rifle stock, pulling her out without a word. They hunted rabbits in the silent, white-coated woods. She was not a bad shot. He'd watch her, her body held still, the heavy rifle braced against her shoulder, and he'd nod. Once, when she hit her mark, they were a team. They moved through the vast, white world, and the bond between them grew in the glances they shared over a fresh track, in the shared warmth of the fire when they returned, cold and weary. But the past does not stay buried, even under 10 feet of snow. One night, the wind rose again, not with the fury of the blizzard, but with a low, mournful moan that rattled the windows. Clara slept badly. She was not on the mountain. She was back in New York, in a place she had only imagined, a place she feared more than death. She was in a cell. It was damp, and it smelled of lime and human misery. She could hear the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the dark. The door creaked open. It was not Eli. It was Silas Whitmore, his face slick with a smile, holding a ring of heavy iron keys.
We told you, Clara,
He hissed, his voice echoing in the small space.
We told you you'd pay. You are a thief, and you will rot here.
Beatrice, his wife, appeared behind him, her face a pale, cruel mask. Forgotten, she whispered. No one will ever look for you here. The walls were closing in. The darkness was pressing on her. She was trapped. Clara woke with a scream that tore from the very bottom of her soul. She was fighting, kicking at the heavy quilts, her hands clawing at an invisible jailer. The curtain to her room was ripped aside. Eli filled the doorway, his shape a massive, terrifying silhouette against the embers of the fire in the main room. He was holding his wood-chopping axe, his knuckles white. "What?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. He scanned the small room, his eyes wild, searching for the threat. "Who's in here?" He saw her, bolt upright in the cot, her hair wild around her face, her eyes wide with a terror he recognized. She was shaking so violently the cot rattled on the floorboards. "No," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "No, please, I didn't take it. Please don't lock me in." He understood. There was no intruder. The threat was old. It was in her mind. Slowly, carefully, he leaned the axe against the doorframe. He walked toward the bed, his big hands, built for axes and rifles, clenched and unclenched. He was a man who knew how to fight bears and blizzards. But this was a grief that was not his.
"You're here,"
he said, his voice rough.
"You're safe. It's just the mountain. It's the wind."
She flinched when he spoke, her breath coming in hitches. She looked right through him, still seeing the cell. He didn't know what else to do. He sat on the edge of the cot. The old ropes groaned under his weight. And then, hesitant, as if touching a hot stove, he reached out. He put his arms around her, pulling her from the tangle of quilts. He held her. He pressed her face against the solid wall of his chest, his shirt smelling of pine smoke and clean cold. He didn't pat her back. He didn't offer soft words. He just held her, a human shield against the shadows. He was an anchor in her storm. Clara buried her face in his shirt and wept. She wept for her dead husband, for the lies of his family, for the life she had lost. She wept for the sheer, grinding terror of being alone and hunted. Eli held her. He held her until the terrible, racking sobs quieted into shudders, and until the shudders quieted into deep, exhausted breaths. He stayed. He did not go back to his bed. He sat upright on the edge of that cot, his back rigid, and he held her. He kept watch. He stayed all night, a silent guardian. And he did not touch her again. When the first gray light of dawn crept into the room, Clara woke, her body stiff, her face pressed against his shoulder. He was still there, awake. He had not slept. She pulled back, embarrassed. I am sorry." "No need." He grunted, his voice stiff from the cold. He rose from the cot, his joints popping, and went to stir the fire in the main room. She followed him. She found him at the hearth, pouring coffee. He handed her a tin mug. She took it, her hands still shaking slightly. They sat at the table in the growing light. "You deserve to know," she said, her voice quiet, addressing the steam rising from her mug. "Who you've been sheltering." He looked at her, his eyes clear and tired. He waited. "I told you I was running. I didn't tell you the whole truth." She took a breath. "My husband's family, the Whitmores, they are powerful, respected. When my husband died, I was in their way. They wanted his business, his money, what little there was. They accused me of theft," she continued, her voice flat. "Of stealing family jewels. They manufactured evidence. They had men who would swear to it. They gave me a choice. I could face the magistrate, and they would see me in prison. Or I could disappear, and they would tell the world I'd gone mad with grief." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I chose to run. I chose exile over being locked up. The dream it was about the prison. Eli, I am terrified of being in a cage." Eli listened. He held his mug in both hands, watching her. He thought of the church women, so quick to judge. He thought of his own prison, the one he had built of guilt and fire. He set his mug down. "You ain't a thief, Clara," he said, his voice absolute. "And you ain't mad. You're just here." He stood and pulled on his coat. "And you ain't in a cage." He went outside, and soon she heard the steady, comforting rhythm of the axe splitting wood. The trail to Rawlins finally cleared enough for the mail wagon. Jed, the wiry driver, made his way up the muddy track, his mule team straining. He looked stunned to see Clara on the porch, shaking out a quilt. "Well, I am damned," he said, pulling to a halt and spitting a stream of tobacco. "You're still alive, ma'am. We'd all well. We was making wagers you'd been eaten by wolves." "I am fine, Mr. Jed," Clara said, her voice cool. Eli came from the barn, signing for the sacks of flour and salt. Jed's eyes darted from Clara, pale but composed, to Eli, bearded and grim. "Folks in town are mighty curious," Jed said, unable to stop himself. "The ladies of the church, particular. They've been praying for your soul." "My soul is my own concern," Clara said. "And her well-being is mine," Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He hefted a flour sack. "You brought the mail. Now go." Jed's eyes widened. "Just delivering the news. Mercer, no need to get salty." He clicked to his mules and turned the wagon, rattling back down the trail. Jed's visit was a stone thrown into the quiet pool of the mountains. The ripples spread fast. In Rawlins, the whispers that had been quiet speculation now became loud, righteous indignation. A woman, a young woman, living up on that cursed mountain with Eli Mercer, the madman, the recluse who had let his family burn. "It's a disgrace," declared Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, over tea. "He's keeping her prisoner, a white slave. She must be rescued." "She is a fallen woman," another pronounced, "living in sin with that animal." 3 days later, a buckboard wagon made the hard journey up the mountain. Clara was outside, feeding the chickens she had adopted. When it pulled into the clearing, it carried Mrs. Davies and 2 other women from her church circle. They wore their darkest, most severe bonnets. They looked like a tribunal. Eli was in the barn, the sound of a hammer on metal ringing out. "Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Davies called, her voice sharp as glass. "Thank the Lord. We found you. We are here to rescue you, dear child." Clara stood up, brushing feed from her apron. "Rescue me? From what, Mrs. Davies?" "From this," the woman said, gesturing at the cabin, at the mountains, at the whole of Eli's life. "From him? We know you are here against your will. You need not be afraid any longer. We have a safe room for you at the church." "I am not here against my will," Clara said, her voice hardening. "Of course you would say that," the second woman chimed in, her voice full of pity. "He has you terrified. We understand, but this is an indecent, sinful arrangement. You must come with us." The hammering from the barn stopped. Eli appeared in the doorway. He was wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was calm. He looked at the women, then at Clara. Clara, hiding just behind the corner of the cabin, held her breath. "She is not going anywhere," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, stopping Mrs. Davies mid-sentence. "Mr. Mercer," Mrs. Davies said, puffing herself up like an angry hen. "This is a matter of Christian charity. This poor woman is fallen. We are here to save her." "Fallen?" Eli took one step out of the barn. The women instinctively took a step back. "This woman has survived a blizzard that would have killed weaker men. She has worked this ranch. She has faced this mountain, and she has not broken. You call that fallen?" "Sir," Mrs. Davies was aghast. "You are keeping her here. It is a sin before God." "The only sin I see," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "is 3 busybodies coming onto my land to judge a life you know nothing about. She is not a prisoner. She is under my protection." "Protection?" Mrs. Davies sneered. "Or do you mean—" "Get off my land," Eli said. Each word was a stone. "Now." The women scrambled. Their righteousness evaporated in the face of his cold, quiet fury. They clambered back onto the buckboard, their faces red. "You will be judged for this. Eli Mercer." "Mrs. Davies shrieked as the wagon lurched into a turn. "You will both burn for your sins." "I've already seen fire," Eli called after their retreating backs. "I am not afraid of yours." He stood there until the wagon was gone. Clara stepped out from behind the cabin, her hand over her heart. He had not just defended her. He had seen her. He had called her strong. In that moment, The last of her fear of him vanished. He turned and saw her watching him. The fury on his face softened, replaced by a deep, awkward embarrassment. He just gave her a short, curt nod. Then he turned and went back into the barn, and the sound of the hammer on metal began again. The confrontation changed the air. The pretense of guest and host was gone. He had drawn a line in the mud, and he had put her on his side of it. And then, as if the mountain wanted to test them, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple. A late, heavy spring storm blew in, dumping 2 new feet of snow, burying the trail, sealing them in once more. The cabin, which had begun to feel like a home, now felt small, charged. The air was thick with things unsaid. Cabin fever, sharp and biting, set in. But it was not a fever of anger. It was a fever of tension. Clara found herself watching his hands as he stoked the fire. She remembered the feel of them, holding her. She watched his mouth as he ate, remembering the words he had spoken to Mrs. Davies, under my protection. Eli found himself watching her. He watched the way the firelight caught the red in her brown hair. He watched her read from an old book of poems, her voice soft in the quiet room. A deep, old hunger, one he thought had died in the fire with Sarah, began to stir. It was an ache in his chest, a tension in his whole body. He took to chopping wood long after dark, the thwack of the axe a punishment, just to be away from the small cabin, just to be away from the heat that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm raged for 2 days. On the second afternoon, Clara went to the barn to gather eggs and check on the hens. The wind was howling. She pulled the heavy barn door shut behind her, and the world went quiet, muffled by the hay and the thick walls. She heard a sound from the back stall, a choked, quiet sob. She rounded the corner. Eli was there, sitting on a low hay bale, his back to her. His broad shoulders were shaking. He was weeping. "Eli?" she said softly. He started, his whole body going rigid. He scrubbed his face with his sleeve, an angry, rough gesture. "Leave me be, Clara. Just go." "What is it?" she asked, moving closer. She saw what he was holding. It was clutched in his 2 big hands, as if he were in prayer. A small cloth doll, its yarn hair faded, its painted-on smile almost invisible. "It was Lily's," he whispered, his voice breaking. My daughter's. It was in an old trunk. I thought they all burned. I thought everything burned." He held the doll, his grief pouring out of him, a terrible, quiet flood. "She loved this thing. She slept with it. I was supposed to fix the stovepipe. I told Sarah I would, but I was angry about the feed. I left them." Clara did not back away. She did not flinch from his pain. She knelt in the straw in front of him. She looked at the doll, then at his face, which was a ruin of grief. "You told me you were late," she said, her voice soft but strong. "But I saw your back. Eli, the night you came in from the rain, those scars. You were not just late. You went into the fire, didn't you? You tried to save them." He looked at her, his eyes streaming. He could not speak. He just nodded, a single, convulsive movement. "Oh, Eli," she whispered. She reached out and placed her hands over his, covering the doll, sharing the cold. "You are allowed to miss her. You are allowed to weep. I am not afraid of your grief. It does not scare me. Let it go." He leaned forward, his defenses shattered. He rested his forehead on her shoulder, and he wept. He wept for his wife, for his brother, and for the little girl with the cloth doll. Clara held him, her arms around his shaking shoulders, her hand stroking his hair. She said nothing. She just knelt in the straw, an anchor, and let him grieve. That night, the storm passed. The world was silent, wrapped in a fresh, white blanket. They sat by the fire. He had not spoken since the barn. He seemed empty, hollowed out, but peaceful. The doll sat on the mantel, next to the cracked photograph of his wife. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I am here."
Those women, they were right. About one thing, this ain't proper. You stay in here. He looked at his hands. I'm a ruined man. I've got nothing. This place is a grave. I have nothing to offer you but ghosts.
Clara looked at him. This big, broken man who had faced down her accusers, who had held her through her nightmares, and who had finally let her hold him through his... She stood up from her stool. She walked over to him. She knelt on the hearth rug, just as she had in the barn. She took his hand. It was rough, but it was warm. "Eli," she said, her voice clear and soft in the quiet room, "I am not asking for promises." She saw the confusion in his eyes. "I am not asking for a future, and I am not asking for you to forget them." She leaned in, her gaze steady on his. I am not asking for anything you cannot give." She leaned in and kissed him. It was not the chaste, healing kiss she had given his scarred shoulder. This was on his mouth. It was warm, and it tasted of salt from his tears and smoke from the fire. He froze. He was a man made of stone, shocked by this sudden, gentle warmth. She pulled back, just an inch, her eyes searching his. "I am not asking for promises," she whispered again. "I'm just asking." He looked at her. He saw the woman who had walked into a blizzard, the woman who had fought off her nightmares, the woman who had knelt in the straw and had not been afraid of his ghosts. Slowly, as if afraid she might shatter, he raised his hand. His fingers trembled. He touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw, brushing her bottom lip. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such tenderness. A low sound left his chest, a sound of longing so deep it was almost a groan. He stood, pulling her up with him. It was not a sudden, passionate sweep. It was slow. It was reverent. He was a man remembering a language he had not spoken in 15 years. He kissed her back. It was clumsy, a kiss of rust and grief. But beneath it was a heat that had been banked, not extinguished. The raw, desperate hunger of a man starved not just of a woman's body, but of her warmth, of her life. He picked her up. His arms, so strong, were gentle. He did not take her to the cold spare room. He took her to his own bed, the one he had slept in alone for a decade and a half. He laid her on the quilts, in the dim, flickering light from the hearth. They looked at each other. There were no more words. Their coming together was not gentle. It was raw. It was slow. It was two people, broken by the world, finding the one part of themselves that was still whole. It was an old hunger awakened. It was reverence and desperation. It was two lost souls clinging to each other in the dark. And for the first time since the fire, Eli Mercer's cabin was truly warm. That night, and the days that followed, were like the first days of a false spring. The air in the cabin was no longer sharp with survival. It was thick with a hesitant warmth, a quiet that was full, not empty. Clara smiled. It was a small thing, but on her face, it was a miracle. It was a shy, slow curving of her lips when he came in from the cold, a look that met his eyes instead of sliding away. He would find her humming by the hearth, a sound so alien in that silent cabin it made him stop and listen. And Eli changed. The hard granite silence that had been his armor for 15 years began to crack. He began to talk. It was not a flood, it was a trickle, but it was a start. "This snow," he said one morning, staring out the window, his hand wrapped around a hot tin mug of coffee. "It's heavy, wet. It'll be good for the creek. The water will run high." Clara, mending his coat, looked up. "Will it flood?" "No," he said. He turned, and there was a strange, distant light in his eyes. It'll clean things out, scour the rocks, that patch of land, down by the bend. Sarah, my wife, she used to plant potatoes there. Good black soil. It's been fallow for a decade and a half." But that soil, it'll be rich. Clara put her mending down. He was not just talking about planting. He was talking about a future. He was talking about we.
The pasture fence, he said 2 days later, gesturing to the collapsed line of posts barely visible in the snow. It's rotted through. Thomas and we built that fence. Used green pine. Foolish. It didn't last. It needs to be redone. Needs seasoned cedar, set deep.
He was planning. He was looking past the snow, past the graves on the hill. He was looking at spring.
They fell into a new, domestic rhythm. They ate together, slept in his bed together. It was a quiet, unspoken thing. They were two people past the point of courtship, past the point of pretty words. They were bound by shared trauma and a shared, desperate need for warmth. He would wake in the night from his own dark dreams of fire, and she would be there, her hand on his scarred back, her breathing a steady comfort. He would hold her when she cried out from her nightmares of prison, his solid presence a wall against her fears. One evening, she was tidying the main room. Her few belongings, her spare shift, her brush, the letter from Thomas that Eli had not burned, were still in her worn carpetbag by the door. It had been weeks, but she still lived as if she might have to flee at any moment. Eli watched her. He watched her fold her last clean apron and tuck it carefully into the bag. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He went into the bedroom. She heard him moving around. He came back out and stood in the doorway.
"Clara."
She looked up. He gestured with his head. "Come here." She followed him into the small room. It was dominated by his bed and a large, heavy bureau made of dark pine. It was the only fine piece of furniture in the cabin. He stood in front of it, with a rough hand. He pulled open the bottom drawer. It was empty, save for the faint, dry scent of cedar and a few dried leaves that had been there for years.
"This one,"
he said, his voice gravelly. "It's empty. You can put your things in here, if you want." Clara stared at the open drawer. "No sense," he mumbled, looking at the floor, suddenly embarrassed. "No sense living out of a bag, like you're a guest." Clara put a hand on the edge of the bureau. The wood was smooth. This was not just a drawer. This was an invitation. This was permanence. This was a man who had built a tomb offering her a place to live within it. It was, in its own way, more than a promise. It was a fact. She touched the bottom of the drawer. Then a sound, a small, choked sob, escaped her. Eli looked up, his face instantly guarded, panicked. He thought he had hurt her.
"What? It's clean."
"No one," she whispered, her voice thick. "No one has offered me a place, a home, not since Arthur died." She turned, and before he could react, she stepped forward and put her arms around his waist. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, and she cried. These were not the terrible, screaming tears of her nightmares. They were the quiet, scalding tears of relief, the tears of a fugitive who had, for a moment, stopped running. Eli stood rigid for a second, shocked by the embrace. Then, slowly, his arms came up. He held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his eyes closed. He held her as if she were the only anchor he had. The peace lasted 4 more days. The trail was thick mud, but passable. A rider came up the mountain. It was not Jed, the mail carrier. This man was a stranger, wearing a town coat and a hard-brimmed hat. He rode a good horse, and he looked like he carried purpose. Eli saw him from the barn. He walked out into the clearing, wiping his hands on a rag, his stance wide, guarded. Clara came to the cabin door, her heart suddenly pounding. "Afternoon," the rider said, stopping his horse 10 feet from Eli. "I'm looking for the Mercer Ranch." "You found it," Eli said. "And I'm looking," the man said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "For a woman named Clara Whitmore." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the doorframe.
Eli did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the rider. "Who are you?" "Deputy Stroud, from Rawlins. We got a telegraph in. Seems you've been a hard woman to find, ma'am," he said, looking past Eli to Clara. "Got a warrant here, forwarded from the U.S. Marshal's office in Montana Territory. Chester County jurisdiction." "Montana?" Clara whispered, her voice thin. "How?" "Seems your family back east. A Mr. Silas Whitmore knew you were bound for Miles City. He filed a charge of grand theft there, anticipating your arrival. It's been circulating for months. You are to come with me to Rawlins. The sheriff needs to hold you until the Montana marshal can be contacted." Clara's world tilted. Silas. He had found her. He had laid a trap, and she had walked right past it, only to be caught in a different one. She started. I will get my things." The deputy nodded, dismounting. "I'll wait on the porch. Ma'am, sorry for the trouble." Clara turned and walked back into the cabin. She was numb. She could feel Eli's presence behind her. He followed her inside, shutting the door. The sound was soft, but it felt like a vault ceiling. The warmth of the last few weeks vanished. The cabin was cold. It was the cabin of that first night. "Eli," she said, her hands shaking as she reached for her old, worn satchel. "You lied." His voice was not loud. It was low, dead, and full of a cold fury that was worse than shouting. "No," she said, turning to face him. I told you they accused me. I told you I was running." "You told me part of it," he snarled, his face a hard mask. "You didn't tell me there was a warrant. You didn't tell me they were hunting you. A lawman, a marshal, coming to my door." "I didn't know," she cried. "I thought I was free of them. I never made it to Montana. How could I know?" "A warrant," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "In Montana. The place you were supposed to go, the place that ghost advertisement was from." He was putting the pieces together, and they were forming a terrible, ugly picture in his mind. He saw it all. The desperate woman in the storm. The sad story, the warm bed. "You were just hiding," he spat. "You found a fool, a lonely old fool on a mountain, and you just used this place to hide." "No!" Her voice broke. "Eli, that is not true. You know it's not." "Do I?" he sneered. The coldness in his eyes was terrible. It was the look of a man who had been betrayed. "I let you in. He couldn't say it. "I trusted you. I planned. I opened my wife's drawer for you." He looked over at the pine bureau. The bottom drawer was still slightly ajar. With a sudden, violent movement, he kicked it. The drawer slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot, the wood splintering. "Get your things," he said, his voice flat. All the fire gone, replaced by ice. "The man is waiting." He turned his back to her, ripped the cabin door open, and stalked out. He did not go to the deputy. He went straight to the barn, disappearing into the shadows. He did not look back. He didn't watch her leave. Clara stood there, her whole body shaking. He believed it. After everything, he believed she was a liar, a common thief who had used him. The rejection was more painful than the deputy's warrant. The deputy cleared his throat from the porch. "Ma'am." Her mind was racing. A hunted animal in a trap. She looked at the barn, where the man who had protected her was now hiding from her. She thought of the whispers. "Mrs. Davies, you will both burn." She would not do it. She would not be the one to drag him back into the fire. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her thin shawl tight. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling but gaining a strange, new strength. "Please, look at me. I am unwell. The sickness I had when I arrived, it has returned. It is a 3-hour ride in this mud." The deputy looked at her. She was pale as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. She looked brittle, like she might break. And Mr. Mercer," she whispered, glancing at the barn. He is not well. My presence, it has been a trial. I cannot face this today. Not like this. The deputy sighed. He was a man, not a monster. What are you asking, ma'am? One night, she begged. I will be in Rollins. I will turn myself in to the sheriff in the morning. I give you my word. I will not run. I need to leave from here on my own. Please, do not make him watch me be taken. Deputy Stroud looked at the barn, then back at her. He rubbed his jaw. He's a hard man, Mercer. I'll give you that. He sighed. All right. I'll tell Sheriff Brody you're coming in. By noon tomorrow. Whitmore, don't make me ride back up this cursed mountain. I will be there, she said. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away, his horse sliding in the thick mud. The silence that descended was absolute. Eli did not come out of the barn. Clara went back inside the cabin. She heard, distantly, the thwack, thwack, thwack of an axe. He was not chopping for the fire. He was splitting wood to keep from splitting something else. She sat at the table for hours. The sun went down. The cabin grew cold. He did not come in. He would not. He was sleeping in the hayloft. She knew. He was sleeping where he slept when the ghosts were too loud in the house. And she was now a ghost. She would not be the cause of his ruin. The town already whispered. If she was tried, he would be called. He would be shamed. The mad recluse who had harbored a wanted thief. She found a stub of pencil and a piece of brown wrapping paper. In the dying light of the embers, she wrote, Eli, you were right. I hid too much. You saved me from the storm, and I am bringing a new one to your door. I will not let them ruin you. 2. I'd rather face prison than see you lose everything again. I am going. Do not follow. Clara. She packed her satchel. She looked at the splintered bureau drawer. She left the note on the table. She opened the door and slipped out into the moonless, freezing night. She did not take the trail to Rollins. She began to walk east, toward the high, impassable peaks. She would rather freeze in the wilderness than be put in a cage. Eli woke in the hayloft, the cold seeping into his bones. His anger had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, sick dread. He had been a fool. He had let his old wounds, his fear of being tricked, of being a fool, override everything he knew to be true about her. He went to the cabin. The door was ajar. The air inside was freezing. The fire was dead ash. She was gone. He saw the note on the table. His hands shook as he read it. I'd rather face prison than see you lose everything again. She was not running from the law. She was running for him, to protect him. You damned, stupid fool, he roared, the words tearing from his chest. He was talking to himself. He did not saddle his horse. He threw the blanket on its back, yanked the girth tight, and launched himself onto it. He rode down the trail to Rollins, his heart a cold knot of fury and terror. Fury at himself, terror for her. She was on foot, in the cold, with no food. He burst into the sheriff's office in Rollins, his coat flying, his face wild. Where is she? Sheriff Brody, a weary man with a tobacco-stained mustache, looked up from his desk. Hell, Mercer, calm yourself. Where's who? Clara Whitmore, the deputy. He didn't bring her in. No, Brody said, scratching his head. She came in herself, turned herself right in. About an hour ago. One of my men found her on the East Trail, half froze. Said she got lost in the dark. She's in the back cell. Eli's legs almost gave out. Relief so sharp it was painful flooded him. She was safe. She was in jail. He stalked to the back. The cells were dark, smelling of rust and despair. She was there, in the last one, sitting on a narrow cot, her back to the door. She was a small, defeated shape. She was in a cage. Clara, his voice was a rasp. She flinched, but did not turn. Go away, Eli, please. I told you not to come. Damn it, Clara, look at me. No, she said,
her voice muffled. "I told you to let me go. This is my fight. It has nothing to do with you. The town is watching. Go home. Fix your fences. Forget I was ever there." "I cannot," he said, his voice raw. He gripped the cold iron bars. "I cannot." She finally turned. Her face was streaked with dirt, her eyes red and swollen. "Why? So you can watch them call me a thief? So you can hear them say I used you? I will not have it. Eli, go!" He stared at her, his heart breaking. He turned, his boots loud on the stone floor, and stalked back to Brody's desk. "Tell me," Eli demanded. "Tell me all of it, the truth." Brody sighed. He was used to men undone by women. "It's a family squabble. Mercer, that's all it ever is." He pulled a stack of telegraphs. "The warrants from Montana. True, but the accusations from New York. Her brother-in-law, Silas Whitmore, says she stole jewels, cash, fled." "She did not steal," Eli said. "It was a statement of faith." "You know that, do you?" Brody raised an eyebrow. "Well, what I know is that this Silas fella is powerful, and he's angry. Been wiring every marshal west of the Mississippi." "Why?" "That's the part that gets interesting." Brody tapped a fresh wire. "I did some asking of my own. Sent a message to a friend back in New York. Seems Mrs. Whitmore's late husband. Arthur wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor. He left a small inheritance, a house, some bonds. Left it all to her." Eli felt his fists clench. The brother-in-law, Silas, was the executor. He tried to claim the inheritance was his. When she wouldn't sign it over, he produced these theft charges, forged a confession from a maid. "My friend says he didn't just want the money. Mercer, he wanted to keep her from getting it. Pride and greed. He buried her in paper." "So it's a lie," Eli breathed. "All of it. The evidence it is forged." "It looks that way," Brody said, leaning back. "But a lie on paper, signed by a judge, is still a warrant. She's got to face it. There will be a court trial. They'll either send a marshal to take her to Montana, or the circuit judge will hear it here. Either way, she stays in that cell until it's sorted." A trial, public, Mrs. Davies, the whispers. Eli walked back to the cell. Clara was standing now, her hands gripping the bars from her side. "I heard him," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "A trial." "I'll be there," Eli said. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "You will not. I will not have you shamed. They will ask who you are. They will ask what I was doing on your ranch. They will call me names. They will ruin you." "Let them," he said. "I will not. I was never your bride. Eli, I was a mistake. I was a letter from a dead man. You owe me nothing." He looked at her, at this proud, terrified, strong woman. He saw the woman who had faced him with a rifle at his door, the woman who had put her hand on his scarred back, the woman who had walked into a jail cell to save him from shame. "The sheriff says I can testify," Eli said, his voice thick. He says they'll listen to a man of property. They'll listen to her fiancé." Clara's mouth fell open. Her hands slipped from the bars. "What? I told you, I was never your bride." Eli pressed his forehead against the cold iron, as close to her as the bars would allow. He could smell the scent of the cold night still on her hair. "Then let me ask you proper," he whispered, his voice breaking. "If you'll still have me." Clara stared at him through the bars, her mind reeling. "Fiancé, Eli, what are you saying? You said that for the sheriff." "I said it," he replied, his voice low and firm. He did not look at Sheriff Brody, who was tactfully studying some papers on his desk. Eli's gaze was fixed only on her. "I am saying it for me, and for you." "But you cannot," she whispered, her hands gripping the iron. "You heard what the deputy said. Silas, he is powerful. And the town. Eli, the town, they will crucify you. They already think you are a madman.
What will they think if you... I've faced scorn. He cut in, his voice flat. Scorn is just wind. Clara, it's just noise. It cannot hurt you if you stand your ground. He turned to Brody. She needs food, and blankets. Real ones, not those. He gestured to the thin, lice-ridden rags on the cot. She's a prisoner, Mercer, Brody said wearily.
Not a guest at the hotel.
She's my fiancée, Eli said, and the words, spoken a second time, had the weight of iron. I'll be back. He walked out of the jailhouse, his boots heavy on the boardwalk. He strode into the Rollins General Store, and the place went silent. The three men playing checkers by the stove stopped, their pieces hovering. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, who was weighing out beans, let a few spill onto the floor. Mrs. Davies was at the counter, inspecting a bolt of black cloth. She turned, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. Well, she said, her voice carrying through the entire store. If it isn't Mr. Mercer, come down from his mountain, we all wondered what it would take. Seems harboring that woman from New York is what it took. That thief, another woman added from the back, her voice dripping with venom. I heard worse, one of the checkers players muttered, not quite meeting Eli's eye. Eli's face was granite. He walked past Mrs. Davies as if she were a sack of feed and stopped at the counter. Henderson, I need 2 thick wool blankets, soap, a side of bacon, and a pound of coffee. The good kind. Henderson looked nervously from Eli to Mrs. Davies, wiping his hands on his apron. Now, Eli, I don't want no trouble in here. I am not here for trouble. Henderson, Eli said, his voice a low rumble. I am here for supplies, for my fiancée, Miss Whitmore. The word dropped into the silence like a boulder into a pond. The checkers slammed down. Mrs. Davies let out a sound like a strangled hen. Fiancé, she sputtered, her face turning a deep, mottled red. You would marry that Jezebel? You would shame the memory of your poor, sainted wife, of your child? Eli turned, very slowly. He was not the wild man from the mountain. He was something colder, something more dangerous. Mrs. Davies, he said, his voice so quiet it was more frightening than a shout. You will not speak my wife's name, not ever. You will not speak my daughter's name, and you will not speak of Miss Whitmore. She is a better Christian than you will ever be. Now, you will step aside. He did not touch her, but she recoiled, her hand flying to her chest, as if he had physically pushed her. He placed his money on the counter. My supplies. Henderson. He gathered the blankets and the food, his hands steady, and walked out. He left a stunned, furious silence behind him. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a pariah, and he had just declared it, loud and proud, to the whole town. He returned to the jail. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, was turning a bruised yellowish gray. The wind was picking up. Storm's coming back, Brody said, looking out the window. A late one. Judge Pettigrew, he's stuck in Laramie. The telegraph just came. He will not be here for 2, maybe 3 days. Clara's heart sank. 3 more days. In here. Eli looked at the cell, at her. You can't stay here. Mercer, I told you, go home. It's going to rain. I am not leaving her, Eli said. Brody sighed. Look, I have a cot in my office. It's warm. You can sleep there. I am not having you cluttering up my jail. She is afraid of cages, Eli said, his voice so low only Brody could hear. The sheriff looked at Eli, then at Clara's pale, drawn face. He saw the desperation in her eyes. Damn it, Brody muttered. He was a lawman, but he was not made of stone. There's a chair. You can sit, but you do not interfere. And you're out by sunup. I run a jail, not a boarding house. I'll stay, Eli said. Night fell. The storm broke. It was not snow this time, but a driving, freezing rain that turned the streets of Rawlins into a river of mud. The wind howled, rattling the single window in the jailhouse. Eli sat on a hard-backed wooden chair, his back to the wall, right outside her cell. His rifle leaned against the wall beside him. He was a sentinel. Clara was huddled under the new, clean wool blankets. They smelled of him, of pine smoke, cedar, and cold air. "You should not be here, Eli," she whispered into the darkness. The only light came from the lantern on Brody's desk. You look so tired. Go to the hotel, please."
"I am not leaving you,"
he said. His voice was a dark rumble in the storm. She could not sleep. The drip of the rain, the howl of the wind, the memory of her nightmare. It was all too much. He could not sleep. He sat upright, watching the shadows. "Eli," she whispered, "sometime after midnight." "I am here." I am so cold." It was not the blankets. It was a cold that came from inside, a fear that chilled her bones. She heard him move. He dragged his chair, the legs scraping on the stone floor. He turned it to face the bars. She got up from the cot. The stone floor was ice. She walked to the bars and sank to the ground, pulling her blankets with her. He did the same. He slid off the chair and sat on the floor, his back against the bars, his legs stretched out. They were sitting on opposite sides of the same wall of iron. "I am right here," he said, his voice thick. She reached her hand out, her fingers barely fitting through the gap. "Eli." He reached his own. He did not just touch her fingers. He threaded his own through the bars, gripping her hand tightly. His skin was rough, calloused, and blessedly warm. Hers was like ice. "Your hand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's here," he said. "I am here. Go to sleep, Clara. I've got the watch." And they stayed like that. They slept, fitfully. Him on the cold stone floor of the jailhouse, her on the cold stone floor of the cell, their hands locked through the iron. It was a vigil. It was a promise. The judge arrived 3 days later. A hard-bitten, weary man named Pettigrew. The storm had broken, leaving the world a sodden, muddy mess. There was no real courtroom in Rawlins, so the hearing was convened in the town's largest saloon, the Silver Spur. The tables had been pushed back, the bar closed. The entire town was there. Clara was made to sit on a chair at the front, next to Sheriff Brody. Eli stood at the back, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Mrs. Davies and her circle of churchwomen sat in the front row, their faces grim and righteous. The judge read the charges, his voice flat. "Clara Whitmore, you are charged by the state of New York, jurisdiction of Montana Territory, with the theft of 1 diamond brooch and $500 in cash. Said charges filed by Mr. Silas Whitmore." A lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne paid for by Silas, stood up. He presented the evidence. The forged affidavit from the maid, which he read aloud. A bank statement showing a large withdrawal from Arthur Whitmore's accounts, dated 2 days after his death.
"This woman,"
the lawyer thundered, his voice ringing in the saloon, pointing a dramatic finger at Clara,
"is a common thief, a black widow who preyed on her grieving in-laws and then fled the arm of justice."
Mrs. Davies leaned over to her friend. "And a harlot," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "Living in sin with that madman Mercer. She has no shame." The judge slammed his gavel.
"Order, Mrs. Davies. You will be silent, or you will be removed."
He turned his cold eyes to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, you have heard the charges. You have seen the evidence against you. How do you plead? What do you say to this?" Clara stood. Her legs were shaking, but she forced her back to be straight. She looked at the lawyer. She looked at Mrs. Davies. She looked at the cold, impartial face of the judge. She knew her words were wind against their paper. She thought of Eli, standing in the back, If she fought, if she spoke of him, she would pull him deeper into this mud. She took a deep breath. "I have nothing to say, Your Honor." A collective gasp swept the room. It was an admission of guilt. The lawyer smiled. A thin, satisfied smirk. "Mrs." Davies nodded, vindicated. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, spreading his hands. "She does not deny it. She is guilty." "I do." The voice came from the back of the room, deep and clear as a bell. The saloon doors, which had been pushed open, were filled by Eli Mercer. He was not the wild man from the mountain. He was not the muddy, tired man from the jailhouse. He was clean-shaven, his jaw sharp and strong. His hair was trimmed and combed. He wore a clean, if old-fashioned, black suit. It was stiff, as if it had not been worn in years. It was Thomas's suit. He looked respectable. He looked solid. He looked like a man who owned land. "Mr. Mercer, this is a court of law," the judge said, his irritation clear. "And I have evidence, Your Honor," Eli said, walking forward. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the judge. He carried a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering. "What is this?" the judge demanded as Eli reached the table. "Sheriff Brody and I," Eli said, his voice filling the room. "We've been busy these last 3 days. He's been using that telegraph machine, and I've been reading." He stepped up to the judge's table and unwrapped the bundle. Inside were several yellowed, brittle letters and a stack of old newspapers. "That lawyer says she stole to get money," Eli said. "But she did not need to, because her husband, Arthur Whitmore, left her everything." He unwrapped the letters. "These," he said, holding one up, "are from her husband, to my brother, Thomas, from years ago, before he even married Clara." "How?" Clara gasped. "They were in that trunk. Clara," he said, giving her one quick, reassuring look. "The one with the doll. I never read them. They were not mine, until now." He turned back to the judge. "My brother Thomas and Arthur Whitmore were friends, back east, before either of them came west. They wrote, and Arthur, he wrote about his family, especially about his brother, Silas." Eli unfolded a letter, his big, rough finger tracing the faded ink. "Arthur writes here, in 1878, my brother Silas has a thirst for money that would drain an ocean and the morals of an alley cat, he says. He has tried to cheat me of my inheritance, and now he tries to cheat my partners. I am making a new will, ensuring he never touches a cent of what is mine." The crowd was stone silent. "And this," Eli said, pulling out a sheaf of papers. "This is what I found in the archive of the Rawlins Gazette, in the basement. I was looking for anything about Silas, and I found this." He laid a yellowed, clipped article on the judge's desk. "It's a New York Business Ledger report from 2 years ago. A notice of bankruptcy for Silas Whitmore Mercantile. The man accusing Clara of stealing $500 was bankrupt. He had nothing. She had the money. He was the one who was desperate." He slapped one final, fresh piece of paper down, a telegraph slip. "And this," Eli said, his voice ringing with a cold, hard triumph. "This is from Sheriff Brody. He got it this morning. It is from that friend of his in New York. The maid, the one who signed that affidavit against Clara?" She recanted. She told the New York police that Silas Whitmore threatened her, that he forced her to sign it. Silas Whitmore is now wanted for questioning by the New York police for perjury and forgery. The room exploded. "Mrs." Davies's mouth was wide open, her face pale. The lawyer from Cheyenne was sputtering. This is highly irregular. It's circumstantial." "It is fact," Judge Pettigrew said, his voice like iron. He had seen enough. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The charges from New York are dismissed. The warrant from Montana is void. Miss Whitmore, you are free to go." Clara swayed, her hand gripping the table to keep from falling. Eli was there in an instant. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He put his arm around her waist, holding her up. The courtroom gasped again, but this time it was a different sound. He held her, and he glared at the crowd, his eyes sweeping over them, daring anyone to speak. "Her name," he said, his voice low and deadly, "is cleared." He led her out of the saloon, past the stunned faces of the townsfolk. As they passed Mrs. Davies, she leaned away from Clara, as if her innocence was a disease. The whispers still followed them, but they were whispers of awe and confusion, not scorn. Eli had his horse and the mule he had rented waiting. He helped Clara onto the mule, his touch gentle. They rode out of Rawlins, leaving the mud and the judgment behind. They rode in silence for the first hour, climbing back up the trail toward the mountain. The air was clean, sharp, and cold. It smelled of wet pine and damp earth. Clara was still shaking, the adrenaline of the hearing slowly leaving her. As they reached the foothills, where the trail turned steep and the cabin came into view on the high ridge, Eli stopped his horse. "Clara!" She stopped the mule and looked at him. He dismounted. He just stood there in the muddy trail, his hat in his hands. The man who had faced down an entire town looked lost. "When that deputy came," he said, his voice thick, his gaze on the ground. "When I saw that warrant, all I could see was that I was a fool. Again. That I had let my heart go soft. And I was being tricked, like I tricked myself about the stovepipe. Like I saw the ruin. I saw the fire." He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of a raw, terrible pain. "I believed the paper. I did not believe you. I turned my back on you. I kicked that drawer." "Eli," she whispered, sliding off the mule. "I am sorry," he said, the words torn from his chest. "I am so sorry. Clara, I was a coward. I let my ghosts hurt you. I'll never forgive myself for that." She walked to him, stumbling in the mud. She took his big, rough hand in both of hers. "Eli Mercer," she said, her voice shaking but strong, "you are the bravest man I have ever known. You rode into that town. You faced all of them. You read your brother's mail for me." A small, watery smile touched her lips. "I forgive you. There is nothing left to forgive." He looked at their joined hands. He squeezed her fingers, his throat too tight to speak. He helped her back onto the mule, and they rode the last mile home. The cabin was cold, silent. The note she had left him was still on the table. He went to the hearth and, with practiced hands, built a fire. The kindling caught, and a hesitant warmth began to creep back into the room. He looked at the trunk, Thomas's trunk, the one that had held the doll, and then the letters that had saved her. "He's been gone 15 years, Eli said, his voice quiet. "And his ghost almost got you killed. And his ghost, it brought you to me. He is at peace now, Eli," Clara said softly, coming to stand beside him. "But his things are not," Eli replied. One by one, he took the items from the trunk, old, worn-out shirts, a whittling knife, the yellowed letters from Arthur. He laid them gently in the hearth, next to the new fire. "Eli, no," Clara said, touching his arm. "The letters, they served their purpose," he said. "They were for the past. We are not living there anymore." He stopped. At the very bottom of the trunk was the small cloth doll. Lily's doll. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. He held it for a long moment, his face tight. Clara put her hand on his arm. "Not that one," she whispered. "We keep that one. We keep the love, Eli, not the pain." He nodded, his throat tight. He carefully placed the doll on the mantel, next to the cracked photograph of Sarah. Then he went to the table and picked up Clara's note. He read it one last time, then tossed it into the flames. He looked at Clara. "It's time, Eli," she said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. Let's bury the dead, not live with them. The next morning, the sun was bright, the air was clean. The spring had truly, finally, come. Eli was outside, poking the ground with a shovel. The ground is soft, he called to her, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it. It's good for setting posts. They worked on the pasture fence, the one he had talked about. It was hard, filthy, satisfying work. He dug the holes, his muscles bunching under his shirt. She helped him lift the heavy, fragrant cedar posts. He tamped the dirt down, and she helped him strain the new wire. They worked as a team. They did not talk much, but the silence was easy, full of the sounds of work and the future. He slipped, his boot sliding in the thick mud, and he went down on one knee. He looked at his mud-covered trousers and cursed, but it was a curse without heat. Clara laughed. It was a real, clear, beautiful sound that echoed off the mountain. He looked up at her, startled. He saw her standing there, her hair coming loose from its pins, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, smiling at him, and a slow, rusty smile cracked his own face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. It changed his entire world. They came to the gate. The old one was rotted, hanging off one hinge. It needs a new name, he said. It was just Mercer Ranch, but it's not anymore. He took his whittling knife from his pocket. He was a good carver. He worked on the new smooth gate post he had just set. He spent an hour on it, the cedar shavings falling at his feet, while Clara gathered the old, rotted wood for burning. He stepped back. He had carved deep into the post one single, clear word, Clara. She came over, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw it. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. It's yours, he said, his voice simple, as if stating a fact of the earth. This place, the ranch, it's yours. Clara, if you'll have it. That night, they were exhausted. They sat by the fire, their muscles aching with good, honest work. The smell of cedar and clean mud was on their skin. The cabin felt different. It was not a grave. It was not a refuge. It was a home. Clara looked at him, at his clean-shaven face, softer in the firelight. The judge, she said, her voice quiet. He called me Miss Whitmore. But you in town, you called me your fiancé. You asked me in the jail, but I never answered. He looked at the fire, his hands resting on his knees. It was for the trial. It was to protect you. Was it? She asked softly. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were clear. No, she smiled. I want to stay. Eli, for real. Not as a fugitive. Not as a mistake from a letter. I want to plant those potatoes with you. I want to live here. With you. He got up from his stool. He knelt on the hearth rug, just as she had knelt for him. He took both of her hands in his. Clara, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in a lifetime. I have nothing. This cabin, it's a ruin. I am a broken man. It is not a ruin, she said, squeezing his hands. It is a foundation. He kissed her hands, one, then the other. He leaned in and kissed her mouth, a slow, deep kiss of promise, not of hunger or desperation. It was a kiss of beginning. Then I'll build you a home, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. With my bare hands, I'll build you a life. Clara, I swear it. The spring that followed was not a gentle thing. It was a violent birth. The snow, piled in drifts as high as the cabin, did not just melt, it was ripped from the mountainside. The small, frozen creek that ran by the pasture became a roaring, muddy river, carrying with it the dead branches and old leaves of a decade. The land was scoured, washed clean, and where the snow retreated, life exploded. The ground, soaked and rich, seemed to sigh with relief. Green, a color so bright it hurt the eyes after the long white, pushed up through the mud, and on the high ridge, on the dark, scorched patch of earth where Eli's first cabin had stood, a miracle happened. Fireweed. Thick stalks of it, pushing up from the ash of 15 years. Its bright, pinkish-purple flowers were a defiant splash of color against the black earth. It was a flower that grew only after a fire. It was the flower of renewal. Clara would go and stand there, looking at the bright blooms, and feel a kinship with them. That spring, she began to feel different. It was a slowness in the morning, a strange, fluttering sensation in her belly that she at first dismissed as hunger or fear. But it was not fear, it was life. She waited. She waited until she was sure, until the truth of it was undeniable. Her body, which had been a vessel for fear and flight, was now a vessel for something else entirely. She did not know how to tell him. How did you give a man who had lost a child in a fire the news that you carried another? How did you offer a hope that could be so easily, so cruelly extinguished? One night, they were in bed, the new, wider bed he had built, sanding the pine boards until they were smooth as silk. He was asleep, or pretending to be. His back was to her. He was still a man who had his demons, still a man who woke in the night, his hands clenched. She reached out, her hand trembling. She laid it on his scarred back, on the landscape of his old pain. "Eli," she whispered. He did not move, but she knew he was awake. His breathing had stopped. I am afraid," she said, her voice small. He turned, slowly, to face her, in the moonlight coming through the small window. His face was all shadows and angles. Afraid? Of what? The town? Silas? No, she whispered. She took his hand, his big, rough, calloused hand. She brought it to her stomach, pressing his palm flat against the gentle, barely there swell. I am afraid of this. He froze. His hand was a dead weight on her. He did not speak. He did not breathe. She could feel the panic rising off him, the cold fear of the past. Eli, please, she said, her own voice breaking. He pulled his hand away as if she had burned him. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He sat there, his back to her, his head in his hands. I cannot, he whispered, his voice choked. Clara, I cannot, not again, I cannot lose. I know, she said, sitting up behind him, her arms wrapping around his chest. She pressed her face against his scarred shoulder. I know. I am afraid. Too, I am so afraid to hope. Eli, it hurts. It hurts more than the fear. He was shaking. He was a mountain, and he was trembling. We do not have to keep it, he said, the words torn from him. A terrible, desperate offer. There are ways. Women in town. No, she said, her voice fierce. She turned him to face her. She gripped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. This is not a ghost. Eli, this is not Sarah. This is not Lily. This is our child. This is the spring. This is the fireweed. It is new. He looked at her, his eyes wild with terror and a dawning, terrible hope. He put his hand back on her stomach, his touch hesitant, as if he were touching a flame. New, he repeated, the word a prayer. He did not sleep that night, but he did not pace. He lay beside her, his hand resting on her, a silent, warm weight. And in the dark, she heard him whisper, his voice rough, You be strong in there. You hear me? You hold on. He was not talking to her. He was talking to the child. Life returned to the Mercer Ranch. It came in a flood. Eli was a man possessed, but not by ghosts. He was possessed by a future. He and Clara planted the potatoes in the black soil by the creek. The soil, he had said, was so rich. They planted beans and corn and squash. He rebuilt the chicken coop, and the half-dozen hens Clara had saved were soon joined by a dozen fluffy, yellow chicks. The sound of peeping filled the air. He worked on the cabin. He built a new room, a small room off the back, with a real window. For the planting, he said, his face red, but she knew it was a nursery. He worked with a quiet, joyful fury. The ranch, which had been a monument to his grief, was becoming a home. And the town noticed. Jed, the mail carrier, was the first. He came up the trail, his wagon full. He did not just drop the mail and run. He got down, his hat in his hand. Mr. Mercer, ma'am, he said, nodding to Clara, who stood on the porch, her belly a gentle, lovely curve under her apron. Town's been talking about what you did in the saloon. Let them talk, Eli said, hefting a sack of flour. Oh, they are, Jed said, a slow smile spreading on his face. But it ain't all bad. Seems folks are impressed. Mrs. Davies, she ain't happy. But the men, they respect a man who stands his ground. And they like a good story. He winked. He went to his wagon and pulled out a small, lumpy parcel. This is from my wife. She heard about, she said this was her mother's, and it ought to be used. He handed it to Clara. It was a small, hand-stitched baby quilt, faded and soft with 100 washings. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I cannot, it's... You take it, ma'am, Jed said, his voice gruff. Welcome to the mountain. They were not pariahs, not completely. There was still judgment. When Eli and Clara rode into Rawlins for supplies, they were a sight. His head held high, and her proud and pregnant, Mrs. Davies and her circle crossed the street to avoid them, their noses in the air, whispering shameful, just loud enough to be heard. But one day, as Clara was waiting outside the general store, a wagon pulled up. It was a woman she did not know, a homesteader's wife from a neighboring valley, her face weathered by sun and wind. You're the Mercer woman, the woman said. It was a statement, not a question. I am Clara, she said, her hands folding over her belly. The woman nodded. I am Martha. My husband is Cyrus. We live over the West Ridge. She reached into her wagon and pulled out a basket. I heard what you did in that saloon. Stood silent. Took it. And I heard what your man did. That was a fine thing. She held out the basket. I got too many tomatoes put up, and I heard you can read proper from New York. Yes, Clara said, confused. My children, Martha said, her face hardening. My boy, Samuel, he's 9, and my girl, Beth, they can't read a lick. The circuit teacher, he comes once a season. It ain't enough. I want them to read. I want them to be better. Clara looked at the basket of red, shining tomatoes. She looked at the woman's proud, desperate face. Bring them, Clara said, a smile blooming on her face. Bring them to the ranch. On Tuesdays, I will teach them. So they came, first Samuel and Beth, then Jed's son, then 2 more children from a ranch down the valley. Once a week, the Mercer Ranch, the home of the mad recluse, became a school. Clara sat on the porch, a slate in her lap, her belly round, and she taught them their letters. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer that woman from New York. She was Mrs. Mercer. She was the teacher. Eli would stand in the barn, pretending to fix a hinge, and he would listen. He would listen to her clear, patient voice and the sound of the children's laughter, and he would feel a peace so profound it almost made his knees buckle. But his own ghost still lingered, the last, deepest one. One night, late in the summer, he had the dream. He had not had it in months. The fire, the smell of smoke, the terrible, suffocating heat. He was running. He was always running. He saw the cabin, a roaring tower of flame. He heard the screaming, Sarah's, Thomas's. And he saw Lily. She was standing just outside the door, in her white nightgown. She was not crying. She was just waiting. "I am coming, baby," he cried, his voice breaking. "Papa's coming." But his feet were stuck. He was in the mud, the thick, heavy mud of the thaw. He could not move. He could not reach her. The old guilt, the crushing, final guilt of his failure washed over him. He was the man who let her burn. "It's all right, Papa," a small voice said. He looked. Lily was smiling at him. It was her smile, the one he had forgotten, the one that crinkled her eyes. "It's all right. It's not your fault." "Lily," he wept, sinking to his knees in the mud. "It's warm now," she said. She turned. The fire was gone. It was a meadow. The meadow from the mountain, covered in fireweed. And Clara was standing there. She was not pregnant. She was just Clara. She was smiling, her hand outstretched. Lily ran to her. She put her small hand in Clara's. Clara knelt and kissed the top of her head, a gesture of pure, simple love. Lily looked back at him, her face bright with joy. She and Clara, hand in hand, turned and began to walk away, not into the shadows, but into a field of sunlight, their forms becoming brighter and brighter until he could not see them. Only the light. Eli woke up. Clara was shaking him. "Eli, Eli, wake up, you are crying." Tears were streaming down his face, soaking the pillow. But he was not in pain. He was not in terror. He sat up and looked at his wife, her face full of concern in the gray dawn light. He touched her cheek. He touched her round, full belly. "It's all right, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. He pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair. She's gone. She's at peace. She likes you," he cried, but for the first time in 15 years. They were not the tears of a prisoner. They were the tears of a free man. A week later, they got married. There was no church. There was no Mrs. Davies. There was just the mountain, and the sky, and the meadow full of fireweed. Sheriff Brody rode up, his hat in his hand and a small, worn Bible in his saddlebag. Martha and Cyrus came, with Samuel and Beth, who stood shy and clean in their Sunday clothes. Clara wore her only good dress, the blue one she had mended. She wore no veil. Eli had gone out that morning and had come back with a handful of late-season wildflowers, purple aster and yellow rabbit brush. He tucked them into her hair, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. They stood under the vast Wyoming sky. Brody read the words, his voice gruff and a little embarrassed. "Do you, Eli Mercer, take this woman?" Eli never took his eyes off her. "I do," he said, his voice deep and sure, a vow that echoed off the mountains. "Do you, Clara Whitmore?" "I do," she whispered, her hand in his, her eyes shining. It was done. Cyrus and Martha clapped. The children cheered. Brody snapped his Bible shut. "Well," he said, "that's that, then. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer." That night, their wedding night, was not like the first time. The first time had been a raw, desperate collision of hunger and grief. This was different. This was peace. He brushed her hair, his fingers clumsy in the long, soft strands. She touched the old, puckered scars on his back, not with pity, but with a familiar, wifely tenderness. They came together not as two broken people, but as two whole people who had chosen. It was a quiet, wordless promise. It was not a fire. It was a hearth. It was the gentle, steady warmth of a life rebuilt, of a healing that was, at last, complete. The circle turned. The fall came, the aspens turning to showers of gold. The harvest was good. The cabin was stocked. The small nursery was ready. And as the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, Clara's time came. It was hard. Martha came and stayed, shooing Eli out of the cabin. He paced the barn, a terror colder than any blizzard gripping his heart. He heard her cry out, and he gripped a fence post until his knuckles were white. Then silence. And then a new sound, a thin, reedy wail. Martha opened the door, her face tired but beaming. "You got a son, Mr. Mercer? A fine, loud son." He walked into the cabin as if in a daze. The room was warm, the fire roaring in the hearth. Clara was in the rocking chair he had built for her hair damp with sweat, her face pale, but shining with a light he had never seen. In her arms, wrapped in the small, faded quilt from Jed's wife, was a baby, his son. He knelt, slowly, his knees cracking. He looked at the small, red, wrinkled face. He reached out one trembling finger. The baby, as if sensing him, uncurled a tiny, perfect hand and gripped it. Eli's breath hitched. He looked at Clara. She was smiling, her eyes full of tears. "He is here. Eli, he's safe." "He's safe," Eli whispered. He sat on the stool by the fire. He was not pacing. He was not a prisoner of the flames. He reached for an old harmonica that had been Thomas's, one he had not touched in 15 years. He put it to his lips, and he played. It was not a sad tune. It was a simple, quiet melody, a tune of planting and mending and a home. Outside, the snow began to fall again. It fell on the new cedar fence, on the roof of the new room, on the meadow of fireweed now gone to sleep. It fell on the graves on the ridge. But inside the cabin, the air was warm. Clara rocked their son, and Eli played his quiet song. The fire burned bright in the hearth. Everything was warm. Thank you so kindly for listening to our story. We would surely love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so you all can connect with each other. Be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on Eli and Clara's journey.